to Michael.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Carl, and thank you for that introduction, and thanks all of you to joining. This is a really interesting subject for me. I've been involved in environmental enforcement, as Carl mentioned, for a couple of years, but prior to that, I studied in criminology, and so I know the complexities that can come along with trying to measure performance in law enforcement in general, but particularly in environmental law enforcement, which has its own challenges, as I'll speak to in a moment in my presentation. The Canadian government, since coming into power a few months back, has made it one of its clear priorities to look at how performance is measured across government, with a focus on environment, but not an exclusive focus. And that includes absolutely how we do enforcement of our environmental laws and regulations in Canada. So we've gone right back to the drawing board in some senses of the word, to start right with the most fundamental question: is what is indeed worthy of measurement, and what is it instructive to measure? And that's why I was so pleased that we were able to get help from our friends at Enns and the Environmental Law Institute to have this discussion, because I really think that if the problems that face us doing environmental law enforcement and protecting the environment aren't global in nature, then I don't know what is. And so this organization was uniquely capable to bring us together to have this discussion, and so my thanks to them. I think I'd like to go from here right into the presentation, so I'll get it up on my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see it, and then I'll run through it, because what I'm most interested in, and I think my colleagues at Enns and the Environmental Law Institute would share this, is to hear your point of view on how you do measurement, how it's worked for you, the challenges you've faced, with the goal of trying to come to a collective understanding about how we can all do this better. So let me get my presentation up on the screen. So you should all have my screen now, and I'll just also let you have a look at me while I'm giving the presentation, so you can keep me honest. And I'll just roll it back here to the beginning. As you can see, I was reminding myself of what to say. So this is a 10-slide presentation, and hopefully you can all see it, and if not, I'd appreciate it if somebody would let me know. Maybe I'll move it to the full screen version. Okay. So what we would like to do is introduce what environmental enforcement looks like at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and just to really set the context for the discussion that we're going to have. I think, as I was talking to Carl and his colleagues, we thought it would be useful to have a concrete basis for the discussion. Not that we want to focus exclusively, obviously, on what's going on in Environment and Climate Change Canada, but it's useful to have something concrete as a starting point. And so for that reason, I'll give you a bit of background on what we do here. From there, we'll get into a more general discussion about the various purposes for measuring performance, and then talk about the positive and negative elements of those approaches. There are common views on what should be measured and not, and the pros and cons of that. I think it's worth reviewing those. And then from there, we would like to move into the discussion, which, as I said, is really should be the focus of why we're here today. So in Environment and Climate Change Canada, we handle environmental enforcement of federal regulations, so regulations that apply across the country. And in particular, my group is in charge of those that fall under the umbrella of pollution. So whether you're talking about toxic substances that might get in the air, water, or soil, or those that are trafficked across international borders. As I mentioned earlier, the Government of Canada has really put an extensive focus on how we do performance measurement in Canada, and there's a number of elements of that, but probably the meatiest element, the one that applies most to us, is the idea of coming up with a very specific, concrete, measurable set of indicators that are credible in that they represent true progress in law enforcement, and credible in that they can be measured in a way that is verifiable. So that's our current challenge, and that's why we're talking to you today, and that's where we'll be looking for to benefit from the discussion in particular. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, there are a number of common ways to measure performance, and I think we're all probably fairly familiar with those. Number one there is that we count the actions that we take. We count the number of times that we go out and do enforcement actions. In our case, we count everything from warning letters that we've issued to regulatees to those that we take to court and seek heavy criminal fines and possibly imprisonment. We count the success and failure of our rates in doing that, and we count the fines that we get, all in an attempt to try to say something about our performance. Like all organizations in government, we have to measure our efficiency in relation to our budget. So all those things that we count, we have to put a dollar figure to the best of our ability on them. And I'm sure that's a common story probably across the group here today. In some senses, we don't do a lot of this, but I know organizations do, and I know there are people that put a great deal of focus on it. Is the measurement of public engagement, the number of referrals, client satisfaction surveys, the engagement of the public in environmental law enforcement, and then the institution in particular. So those are a lot of the most common measures of how we do things. And as you can imagine, there's a lot to say about the weaknesses of some of these approaches. And in particular, it's that they all only really provide a partial picture at best, and at worst, they can provide us with a misleading picture. So if you just count the number of enforcement actions that you undertake, variations in that number, you have no way of determining whether or not they're meaningful unless you measure them in relation to a baseline. I remember growing up in Victoria, BC, which is on the far west coast of Canada. There was a policy instituted by the local police department that in any case where there was bullying taking place in a school, the officer was obliged to treat that as a criminal offense, as assault under the criminal code. And as you can imagine, about 12 to 24 months later, there was a rampant increase in the number of assault charges in Victoria involving youth. And that's an example of misleading information. For all we know, the number of assaults could have been the same or even decreased, but because of police attention on that specific issue, it created what is sometimes called a moral panic, and people in Victoria were locking their doors afraid of swarming teenagers as a result. And that's an extreme example, but it's not unlike what we do when we look at numbers of enforcement actions and prosecutions independent of a baseline. We all want to focus on the highest risk offenses, and in the environment we have particular challenges in framing that issue, and we have the same challenges that they have in law enforcement. I think we have an additional challenge in how we frame what's truly meaningful from an environmental perspective. And to trace what we do and its impact on those things that matter the most is very challenging. It's particularly challenging to do in a quantitative way. There are qualitative measures that involve narratives and more informal information to attempt to draw that link, but it's very hard to count and to quantify in a way that's meaningful, particularly for decision makers. Public surveys are I have serious concerns about public surveys. I think that they are valuable to an extent, but they again have a serious problem in terms of their way to be misleading. Those that participate in them are not often representative of those that genuinely require the services of a law enforcement agency or an environmental law enforcement agency. And often, all these measures, even put together, are too broad to really be meaningful in an operational planning context. So when I think about where to move money and resources and officers around in my organization, the counting of enforcement actions, the numbers of prosecutions and public surveys tell me very little about, from a meaningful standpoint, about how to do that. And so those are some of the weaknesses. Those measures do have a strength in that, if they're collected diligently and you do incorporate baselines and you do it over a period of time, you can look at trends and you can understand, in a limited extent, your impact in your target areas. But as I've tried to make clear here, there are weaknesses here that are quite significant. So I'll move to the next slide. As I said, it's very difficult to define in the work that we do what constitutes a meaningful focus with respect to environmental crime. So when we go out and do environmental enforcement, how do we know we're focused on the things that are the most serious? In Canada, we have a decision that was brought down by a Supreme Court in one of the provinces, but has since been reiterated in a number of courts across the country, including the Supreme Court. Is there's a number of factors that need to be taken into account. Culpability, which is essentially the level of guilt or responsibility of the party, prior record, remorse, environmental harm, and deterrence. Prior record and remorse, in some cases, are the easiest and they're the most obvious and the ones we're the most used to. Culpability can be very challenging to show in pollution cases, at least. In particular, a high level of culpability. If you look at, for example, the Deepwater Horizon incident off the east coast of the United States, the challenge in going inside an organization the size of BP to determine levels of accountability where there are hundreds or thousands of people involved in all the decisions that led up to that disaster can be very complicated to pull apart and very complicated to hold anyone to account. It doesn't make it impossible, but it does make it an ongoing challenge. Environmental harm and deterrence are ones that I think are uniquely challenging for us as people in the environmental field. The challenges in terms of showing environmental harm that I talked about a little bit and I'll get into again on the next slide, but also deterrence. For deterrence, whether you're talking about specific deterrence or general deterrence to be meaningful, it has to be on measure with the seriousness of the offense, which, as we talked about, is hard to show in the environmental field because of the issue of culpability, but also because of the difficulty in quantifying damage to the environment. So, a common byproduct, for example, of mining is the release of selenium. There's a lot of worse things that are byproducts of mining, but that's a fairly common example. Selenium can get into the environment in certain quantities, and it can be relatively harmless. It is already part of the natural environment, and to distinguish between what's new and has been introduced by virtue of the mining activity is challenging, but then to show what the difference is in terms of the damage to environment between the naturally occurring selenium and the selenium introduced to the environment by virtue of mining, and to tie that to a specific harm can be very challenging, and you're often talking about years-long efforts that include experts from a broad variety of academic disciplines to do that. It doesn't mean it's not worth it. I very much believe it is worth it, but it just does give us a sense of the challenge and its connection to our goal of doing good performance measurement. We'll go to the next slide. However, there are ways to show damage to the environment, and there are ways to show it's significant. When you're talking about bodies of water, it's very common in Canada, and I would assume in other jurisdictions, to tie it directly to damage to fish. It doesn't make the fish themselves necessarily the central focus of your study or your attempt to define the environmental harm, but you can in very clear ways show the damage of the toxic substances due to fish, in particular if there's mass kill-offs of fish. Like, for example, we're dealing with on the east coast of Canada now in the Grand Banks region. We can show persistent and ongoing impacts, and we can show that once those things enter the environment, it's very difficult to get them out, and that can be tied to harm. We can also, although it's much more difficult, show the damage from an ecosystem standpoint and people's use of the natural environment. And that's a kind of a new thing to do in the courts, at least as far as Canada is concerned. But the point on spiritual purposes is particularly important in Canada because of the unique legal status of Aboriginal or Indigenous people in Canada and their tie to the land itself. They have specific legal rights in Canada, and those things can show up in terms of quantifying the environmental harm that's done to environment that they use for recreational or spiritual purposes. Okay, when you look at crimes to air quality, they can be very difficult to justify on the basis of the damage of one particular crime. You look at, for example, a bust that we did in Canada that included taking 600 non-compliant engines off the street. The actual amount of emissions over and above what's legal in Canada from those engines, it was difficult to show that that had a significant impact from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective on a national level. However, we were able to reframe the discussion to show that local air quality was impacted, that there were health considerations, and that it's not about this one individual bust of 600 engines. It's about the impact that we can have on global supply chains as a result. So that's about reframing the discussion, and that's relevant for when you want to talk about how to do your performance measurement. And that last point is sort of some added color around the issue of engines, so I won't speak to that directly. You do have to think about your stakeholders in terms of performance measurement. Where are you trying to have an impact? And there's all kinds of ways that you may be expected to produce impacts, whether it's at the environmental level, but it can also be directly with citizens, directly with specific stakeholders, directly with a particular group of regulatees. And all that's highly relevant when you're framing your performance measurement strategy. So what should we measure? Which is the subject of discussion today. And I won't attempt to answer that question directly, but I would say that these are our thoughts here in Canada about some of the guiding principles that need to be present in any discussion about performance measurement. So as we started out by saying, those measures that we typically use of counting things, counting our actions, counting their impact in ways that are evident, do have a value. They should be done, but they're not sufficient. You need to look at multiple measures. It's not about finding one particular measure that will suit your needs. You need to look at measures that explore the impact of your work across the organization and at all levels of it if you want to impact decision making. There's various scopes that you can look at, and all of these are relevant in my view, depending on the nature of what it is you want to accomplish and what you want to be able to demonstrate. So there's a number of subcategories mentioned, and I hope we get into those in the discussion. And the last thing is to really be clear on the environmental harm, I think, that you're trying to produce, and not to allow that discussion just to percolate at the national or global levels, but also to consider local impacts where the impact of particular crimes can be demonstrated more fully. So with that, I'll close with some discussion topics, although I'm very much open to discussing anything with this group that it considers worthwhile. I think it's interesting, though, for us to think about it as a group, what constitutes success for our organizations. And that's not as easy a question, I find, when you get into it as it may initially appear. We can all say that we want to both impact crime and environmental issues, but the specifics and the details of what that mean become hard to define if you take them seriously, in my view, in my experience. And that's all about how you frame the discussion in your organization. Are you going to leave it to inputs, outputs, and outcomes, the traditional measures? Are you going to take into account media considerations? Maybe this is a reality of how your organization has to operate, is that the media is an aspect of your work. And what are the pros and cons of those approaches? So with that, Carl, I'll close off my presentation and give the floor back to you.